Before Phil Collins became the drummer people measured other drummers against, he was just a small boy staring at a television screen, feeling something inside him move before he had words for it. It was not fame he wanted at first. It was not applause. It was not even the idea of becoming a star. It was the beat. That simple, mysterious, steady thing coming from behind the singers. The part most people heard without thinking about it. The part that held the whole song together. The part that made young Phil lean forward as if someone had quietly called his name from inside the music. And on that screen, behind John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison, there was Ringo Starr. Ringo did not look like a grand showman. He did not have to. He sat there with that calm, unforgettable presence, smiling just enough, moving with a natural certainty that made the drums feel less like an instrument and more like a secret language. To millions of young people, the Beatles looked like the future. But to Phil Collins, something even more specific was happening. He was not only watching a band, he was watching the place where he belonged. Years later, people would talk about Phil's power, his precision, his fills, the thunder of Genesis, and the haunted explosion of In the Air Tonight. They would talk about the man who could sing heartbreaking songs and still make arenas shake. But the beginning was quieter than that. It was a boy realizing that the person at the back of the stage could still control the heartbeat of the room. That was the first wound of rhythm, and it never healed. Phil had been drawn to sound almost before he understood music. As a child in West London, he was restless, bright, eager, the kind of boy who absorbed the world through noise and movement. A drum kit was not just a toy to him. It became a place to put all the feelings he could not explain. Frustration, joy, excitement, loneliness. Energy too large for a small body. The drums gave those feelings a shape. But when the Beatles arrived, something changed. They made popular music feel possible. Not distant, not untouchable. Possible. They were young men with haircuts, humor, charm, and songs that seemed to fly straight through the walls of ordinary homes. And Ringo, sitting behind them, showed Phil something he would carry for the rest of his life. The drummer did not have to be hidden. The drummer could be loved. The drummer could be the soul no one noticed until the song collapsed without him. That idea stayed with him. He saw Ringo and understood, maybe not in a sentence, maybe not consciously, that the drums could be more than noise. They could be personality. They could be timing. They could be kindness. They could be restraint. They could be the difference between a song that simply played and a song that breathed. And that is the hidden beginning of Phil Collins. Not the stadiums, not the awards, not the painful divorces, the lonely studios, the huge Genesis tours, or the solo career that made him one of the most familiar voices in the world. Just a boy watching Ringo Starr and realizing that some people do not choose the beat chooses them. But a childhood spark is only the beginning. A boy can be inspired in one evening, then spend the rest of his life proving that the feeling was real. Phil did not become Phil Collins because he admired Ringo Starr from a distance. He became Phil Collins because he took that first fascination and turned it into discipline. He played. He listened. He copied. He tried again. He learned that the drums could not be faked. A singer could hide behind charm for a moment. A guitarist could cover a mistake with volume. But a drummer had nowhere to run. If the time was weak, everyone felt it. And Phil wanted the time to be strong. The influence of Ringo gave him the doorway, but behind that doorway came long hours, aching hands, schoolboy bands, rehearsals, theater work, jazz records, and the discovery of other drummers who stretched his imagination. Buddy Rich showed him speed and command. Soul and Motown records showed him feel. But Ringo gave him the first emotional permission. Ringo made the drums look like a life. That distinction matters. Because Phil Collins did not grow into a drummer who played only to impress other musicians. He became a drummer who served the song. That is what made him dangerous. He could be explosive, yes. He could fill a measure with astonishing force. But he also understood silence. He understood where not to play. He understood that the greatest drummers are not always the ones who make the most noise. Sometimes they are the ones who make everyone else sound inevitable. That was Ringo's lesson, whether Phil knew it or not. And then came Genesis. When Phil joined the band in 1970, he was not the front man. He was not the face. He was the drummer sitting behind Peter Gabriel's strange masks, theatrical stories, and commanding presence. Genesis was not built like a simple pop group. The music twisted and unfolded. The songs stretched out like journeys. The drummer had to be precise, imaginative, patient, and fearless. Phil fit because he could listen. He could hold the band together through complicated passages without making the music feel mechanical. He could push when the song needed danger. He could pull back when the story needed air. In a band full of ideas, his job was to make those ideas breathe. But there was another irony hiding in the shadows. The boy who had once watched Ringo prove that a drummer could be loved was now becoming one of the most important drummers in progressive rock, yet still sitting behind someone else. The audience saw Peter Gabriel first. They heard Tony Banks's keyboards, Mike Rutherford's lines, Steve Hackett's guitar colors. Phil was essential, but essential in the drummer's lonely way. If he did the job perfectly, some people did not notice him at all. That can do something to a man, not because he needs constant praise, but because there is a strange loneliness in holding everything together while the spotlight falls somewhere else. Phil understood that place from the inside. The drummer is responsible for the pulse, but the pulse is often taken for granted. Then Peter Gabriel left. Suddenly, Genesis had a wound in the center of the stage. The voice was gone. The face was gone. The strange theatrical identity that had carried the band into the imagination of fans was gone. They auditioned singers. They searched. They listened. And somewhere in that uncomfortable process, the drummer behind the kit became the answer no one expected. Phil stepped forward. But stepping forward did not erase the boy who had watched Ringo. It made that memory even more powerful. Because Ringo had shown him that a drummer could have personality, Genesis forced him to discover that a drummer could have a voice. It was terrifying. The microphone was not like the drum kit. Behind the drums, Phil could disappear into motion. He could sweat, strike, count, and survive. At the microphone, there was nowhere to hide. Every breath became personal. Every crack in the voice became human. Every lyric exposed something the cymbals used to protect. And still, the rhythm stayed. Even when he became the singer, Phil never stopped being a drummer at heart. You can hear it in his phrasing. You can hear it in the way his voice lands on a line. You can hear it in the emotional timing of his songs. He did not just sing melodies. He placed them, like drum hits, exactly where they would hurt the most. That began with listening. And listening began with that boy in front of the television, watching Ringo Starr make the back of the stage feel like the center of the world. The strange thing about influence is that it does not always look dramatic at the time. No thunderclap, no speech, no one standing in the doorway saying, "This is the moment your life begins." Sometimes it is just a child watching a drummer on a television screen and feeling less alone. For Phil Collins, Ringo Starr was not simply a famous Beatle. He was proof. Proof that rhythm could have warmth. Proof that a drummer could be remembered not only for technical brilliance, but for feel. Proof that sitting behind the band did not mean being unimportant. The back of the stage could still carry the soul of the song. And Phil carried that proof into everything. He carried it into Genesis, where his drumming helped turn complex music into something alive and human. He carried it into the frightening years after Peter Gabriel left, when he had to step out from behind the kit and risk being rejected by the very fans who had accepted him as a drummer. He carried it into his solo work, where heartbreak became rhythm and loneliness became sound. He carried it all the way to that famous drum break in the Air Tonight. By then, Phil Collins was no longer the boy in the living room. He was a man with a broken marriage behind him, a career changing beneath his feet, and a private sadness that millions would soon feel as their own. But when those drums finally crashed in, it was still the same story in another form. A feeling too large for ordinary words had found its way through rhythm. That is what the drums had always been for him. Not decoration, not background, not a place to hide forever. They were the language he trusted before he trusted his voice. And maybe that is why his music lasted. Because even when Phil Collins became one of the most recognizable singers of his generation, he never sounded like a singer who had forgotten the beat. He sounded like a drummer who had learned to confess. That is a rare thing. A drummer hears the world differently. He hears the spaces between words. He hears footsteps in a hallway, the closing of a door, the pause before bad news, the silence after someone leaves. Phil turned those silences into songs. He turned private wounds into choruses people could carry in their cars, their kitchens, their marriages, their divorces, their aging hearts. And behind it all, somewhere far back at the beginning, there was Ringo Starr. Not as an imitation, not as a shadow, as the first open door. A reminder that the drummer could be more than the man keeping time. He could be the man keeping feeling alive. So when people ask who inspired Phil Collins to become a drummer, the simple answer is Ringo. But the deeper answer is this: Ringo Starr showed Phil Collins that a beat could hold an entire life inside it. And Phil spent the rest of his life proving it. If stories like this remind you why this music still matters, subscribe for more hidden stories from Phil Collins and the legends who gave everything to the music.